Hello, and welcome to another knitting vlog. In today's video, I will be knitting a pullover from a 1950s German pattern book. Before I get into the actual knitting, I'd first like to give you some background information and tell you about the pattern's original structure. So the pattern that I knit is this beautiful pullover called Modell 40, Damenpullover mit runder geribbter Passe. This translates to Model 40 women's pullover with round ribbed yoke. So just a plain description. The pattern comes from the 4th issue of Constanze Strickmoden. This was a yearly special edition of Constanze, which was a women's magazine from West Germany that ran from 1948 till 1969. From my experience searching online for these editions, I found them to be very scarce and sometimes high priced. I've yet to get my hands on one of them, but I managed to find a webpage through the Wayback machine to a blog where someone posted this particular pattern, so I got very lucky with that. Now on to the actual pattern. In accordance with German copyright law, I'm only allowed to include 15% of the full pattern instructions in my video, so I'll mostly just be explaining everything verbally, which is easier anyways, as I don't assume that most of my audience knows German. Yes, so the instructions are written for a bust circumference of 90 to 98 centimeters, and from the diagram that accompanies the written instructions, the pullover is meant to have anywhere from 6 centimeters of negative ease to 2 centimeters of positive ease. Similarly to many other vintage patterns, this pullover is knit flat. You start at the back casting on for a 2x2 ribbed border of 8 centimeters, after which you increase the body. Working your way up, you continue to increase stitches on both ends of the back, creating the more fitted shape that many 40s and 50s vintage sweaters have. After working the body in stockinette stitch for 22 centimeters, the height of the armhole is reached. From here, more stitches are added to the side, thus shaping the sleeves. The first and last 9 stitches of each row are knit in garter stitch, creating a similar finished look to 1x1 ribbing that is mostly done for sleeves. Once the back reaches 50 centimeters from the cast-on edge, the shoulders are shaped by binding of stitches every row for 3 centimeters. The remaining stitches at the center of the back are then put on hold. The front is knit in the same way as the back up until the armhole shaping, as at that point stitches are gradually cast off at the center front, creating a circular outline. Once all stitches of the front piece are cast off, stitches for the yoke are then picked up along the half circle cast off edge. The yoke is worked using a motif that consists of 3 sections of 2x2 rib, which are separated by several rows of garter stitch. The yoke is decreased evenly at the beginning and end of every garter stitch section, excluding the end of the last section. Once the top of the front is reached, the stitches of the back that were left on hold are picked up and a 2x2 ribbed collar is knit for 4 centimeters. Finally, the stockinette stitch sections are steamed from the wrong side before seaming the back and front together. I thought this would be an excellent spring/summer piece, so I got to work with adjusting the pattern to my taste. When I'm working on vintage patterns, I don't really care too much about matching the gauge of the original pattern. I have found that most of these older patterns are rather concise, which makes it very easy for me to understand the construction, especially when, like with this one, they include schematics. And so I generally just pick the yarn that I would like to knit with, choose my needle size, knit up and measure a swatch, and then I'll use the numbers of that swatch to calculate the percentage increase or decrease in stitch and row count from the original gauge. I then use those numbers to adjust the pattern such that the dimensions remain approximately the same. So that's what I did for this pattern. I chose this lace weight lamb's wool that was in my stash, and I know it's not particularly a summer yarn, but it's really soft and works very well for Dutch spring and summer. So here I am casting on for the pullover. Looking at the picture of the pattern, I had initially assumed the ribbed yoke to also be at the back. That wasn't the case, but I decided that I still wanted that for my own piece, and so I had to come up with a construction to achieve this. I eventually settled on knitting the pullover top down with a circular yoke and then knitting the body flat. I generally prefer to knit things flat these days because it makes my knits last longer, and also I have more opportunity to improve the tensioning discrepancy between my knits and purls. Holding the yarn double, I cast on using the number of stitches that were on the needle when starting for the collar converted to my own gauge. For the increases at the back, I just used the same increase rate that was used for the front yoke, and luckily that all worked out. Since I was knitting a circular yoke and thus wasn't doing any of the shoulder shaping from the original pattern, I had to make sure I wouldn't get choked by the fabric at the neck. I came up with two options: either adding some extra rows at the back around the armhole shaping, or just adding short rows in the yoke. I decided to add some Japanese short rows as I'm most comfortable with this technique. However, at the pointed time of knitting this pullover, I only had experience with knitting short rows in sections of stockinette. It became very clear that placing them in the garter stitch section would be very disruptive, as the start and end points of the short rows would be marked by the appearance of a new garter stitch ridge. So 2x2 rib it was. I have found that short rows with a maximum depth of 2.5 to 3 centimeters work fine for me, and so with a gauge of 23 stitches by 32 rows for a 10 centimeter square, this came down to about 8 short rows. I decided to divide the short rows over the first 2 ribbed sections, as having 1 short and 2 slightly longer ribbed sections at the back would be less noticeable than having 2 short and 1 very long ribbed section instead. As for the percentage of the sweater circumference covered by the short rows from start to finish, I just kind of winged it, as I couldn't find any resources on where to exactly place them. A rough estimate I think would be 60% going up to 80%. So this is how things are looking after finishing the ribbed yoke section. As you can see, the short rows, or maybe as you cannot see, the short rows are almost invisible because of the busy pattern, which I was really happy about. The back looks a bit like it's riding up, but this is a moment where I just had to be confident in my calculations, as I hadn't yet worked down to the body. For the stockinette section of the yoke, I tried to keep the increases similar to those that I did at the ribbed section, and knit until I hit an armhole depth I felt would be appropriate for me. It was now time to split for the sleeves. I probably didn't search hard enough on the internet, but I couldn't find a good resource on how to split for sleeves with a circular yoke sweater, and so I ended up just calculating the number of stitches I wanted for the sleeves and the body, considering that I would cast on about 4 centimeters worth of stitches at each underarm. Using that information accordingly, I divided the stitches for the body and sleeves and put the sleeve stitches on hold. Trying on the pullover at that point, it seemed that my armhole depth was too shallow and that I also didn't have enough stitches for my sleeves. I ended up adjusting my stitch distribution and spread the stitches I wanted to cast on at the underarm over a number of rows. I was still very uncertain at this point about the sleeves, and so I decided to knit the back and front section flat for a couple of centimeters and then use some scrap yarn to seam the parts together and finish one sleeve so I could get a better look at the fit. trying on the pullover, I felt that the sleeve was quite wide, especially at the back of the underarm. I thought about it for a while, got a second opinion, and eventually just decided to go ahead and finish off the piece. This meant that the hardest part was over and I just had to knit 2 straight rectangles and do some seaming. And here is the final result. I am so happy with how it turned out. I had initially planned to include the collar afterwards, but I already really liked the way it was looking without it. Aside from that, I put aside some DK weight yarn in my stash to knit a long sleeve sweater version of this pattern that is more true to the original with a collar. So if you'd like to see how I fare with that, you can subscribe to my channel. In any case, thank you very much for watching, enjoy the rest of the showcase, and I hope to see you soon in another video. Bye bye!